Welcome, dear dreamer. You've arrived at a safe place, where the worries of the day slowly fade away. Here, our bedtime stories are crafted to quiet your mind and cradle you into the calmest sleep. Before you drift off, share with us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. What time the stars greet you tonight, and one little joy that made your day brighter. If these stories bring you peace, kindly tap the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so that each evening a new story finds its way to you. Your support truly inspires us to keep weaving these restful journeys. Now, close your eyes, slow your breath, and let the story carry you gently into dreams. By 1901, the 5 Points Gang could summon thousands of enforcers with a single call. Not dozens, thousands. This wasn't just street muscle. This was an organized army operating in the heart of Manhattan, with tentacles reaching into every major political decision in the city. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. It all started with one Italian immigrant who understood something about power that others missed entirely. Tonight, we'll uncover the quiet genius behind this transformation. What transforms an ordinary immigrant into a criminal mastermind? Tonight, we begin with a young man who arrived with nothing but his name. Paolo Vaccarelli stepped off the boat into New York Harbor sometime in the 1890s, carrying the same dreams as millions of other Italian immigrants. He had calloused hands from honest work and eyes that hadn't yet learned to see around corners. Like so many others, he found himself swept into the crowded streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side, where survival meant making quick decisions about who to trust and who to avoid. Paolo Vaccarelli landed in New York's most dangerous neighborhood, where survival meant choosing between honest poverty and profitable violence. The 5 Points district stretched out before him like a maze of narrow streets and towering tenements, each building packed with families who had made that same difficult choice. Honest work paid maybe $10 a week, if you were lucky enough to find it. The factories were dangerous, the hours were long, and the bosses treated Italian workers like they were disposable. But on every corner, Paolo could see other options playing out in real time. The men with clean shirts and full pockets weren't breaking their backs in sweatshops, while other immigrants struggled just to eat. Paolo notices something others miss. The real power isn't in the streets, it's in the shadows behind them. Most newcomers focused on the obvious displays of strength. They watched the street fighters throwing punches and the gang members marking territory with violence. But Paolo's attention wandered to quieter scenes that played out every day. He noticed how certain conversations stopped when strangers approached. He saw how money changed hands in specific locations at predictable times. Most importantly, he observed that the men giving orders rarely raised their voices or made threats. They simply spoke, and others listened. We see him watching, learning, studying the flow of money and influence through the 5 Points district like a patient student. Paolo positioned himself where he could observe without being noticed. He lingered outside saloons not to drink, but to hear how decisions were made. He watched the gambling houses and noticed that the real profits went to the people who never touched the cards or dice. He studied the faces of men who collected protection money, paying attention to their methods and their mistakes, while his fellow immigrants rushed to find any work that would put food on their tables. Paolo invested time in understanding the invisible systems that controlled their neighborhood. The cramped tenements and narrow alleys become his classroom, teaching lessons no school could offer. Every conversation overheard through thin walls provided information about who owed money to whom. The layout of buildings taught him about escape routes and hiding places that might prove useful later. He learned which police officers could be bought and which ones couldn't. More importantly, he discovered that fear and respect operated by completely different rules. Fear made people avoid you, but respect made them come to you with problems they needed solved. Paolo began to see that the most successful criminals weren't the loudest or the strongest, but the ones who made themselves indispensable to their communities. He begins to understand that brute force alone never built lasting empires. It's the quiet observers who rise above the noise. The gang leaders who relied purely on violence found themselves constantly fighting new challengers. Their organizations fell apart whenever they were arrested or killed because everything depended on their personal presence and physical intimidation. But Paulo noticed that certain operations continued smoothly, even when their leaders disappeared for weeks or months. These successful organizations had systems and structures that functioned independently of any single person's muscle or temperament. Paulo starts making small changes to his approach, subtle shifts that seem insignificant but reveal a deeper intelligence at work. Instead of picking fights to establish dominance, he began offering solutions to other people's problems. When disputes arose between neighbors, Paulo volunteered to mediate rather than choose sides. He started learning English more seriously, recognizing that language barriers limited his ability to understand and influence the broader community. He began dressing slightly better than his income would normally allow, understanding that appearance shaped how people responded to his suggestions and requests. The other street thugs see just another tough guy, but Paulo is already thinking 3 moves ahead. While they planned their next robbery or assault, Paulo considered how today's actions might affect next month's opportunities. He thought about which alliances would prove valuable over time and which enemies might be converted into allies with the right approach. When other gang members bragged about their latest scores, Paulo listened carefully to understand not just what they had done, but what weaknesses their methods revealed. He began to see patterns in law enforcement responses and political reactions that others ignored completely. By the time he chooses the name Paul Kelly, he's already decided that this American dream will be built on American rules, power, politics, and patience. The name change represented more than just adopting American customs. It marked Paulo's recognition that success in this country required understanding and working within existing power structures rather than simply opposing them. American criminals who lasted built relationships with politicians, judges, and business leaders. They learned to present themselves as community leaders rather than neighborhood threats. Paul Kelly would speak the language of progress and civic improvement while pursuing goals that Paolo Vaccarelli could never have achieved through traditional Italian criminal methods. This quiet transformation from Paolo to Paul marks the first step in a journey that will reshape organized crime forever. The patient observation, careful planning, and strategic thinking that Paul Kelly developed during these early years would become the foundation for innovations that spread far beyond New York's 5 Points district. Why did the 5 Points become America's breeding ground for organized crime? The answer lies in a perfect storm of circumstances that most people never noticed. Imagine a neighborhood where the normal rules simply didn't apply, where thousands of people lived packed together but somehow remained invisible to the authorities who were supposed to govern them. This wasn't just about poverty or immigration. Something much more interesting was happening in these crowded streets. Something that created opportunities for anyone clever enough to recognize them. While politicians debated immigration, uptown, downtown Manhattan was becoming a powder keg of desperate people and unlimited opportunity. The wealthy neighborhoods north of Canal Street buzzed with discussions about proper integration and American values. But those conversations never quite made it down to the actual immigrants they were discussing. City Hall functioned as if the Lower East Side existed in theory rather than reality. Municipal services that worked smoothly in respectable districts simply stopped at certain invisible boundaries. The result was a neighborhood that operated by its own logic, where informal systems filled the gaps left by absent government. The 5 Points wasn't just poor, it was invisible to law enforcement, creating a space where new rules could be written by whoever was smart enough to see the potential. Police patrols ventured into these streets reluctantly and briefly, more interested in getting out safely than actually enforcing laws. The few officers assigned to the area quickly learned that their official authority meant very little in practice. Residents had learned not to expect help from outside institutions, so they developed their own methods for handling disputes and maintaining order. This created a vacuum that someone like Kelly could step into, not as a criminal disrupting society, but as an organizer providing services that nobody else bothered to offer. Gambling dens operated openly next to legitimate businesses, creating a gray area where legal and illegal blended together seamlessly. You could buy groceries, place a bet, and get your shoes repaired all on the same block without anyone treating this as unusual. The boundaries that existed clearly in other parts of the city became fluid here. Shop owners who sold legal goods during the day often provided other services after dark. Restaurants served food to families in the front rooms while card games ran in the back. This mixing of legitimate and illegitimate activities meant that criminal enterprises could hide in plain sight, protected by the everyday business of neighborhood life. Immigrant communities brought Old World loyalties but needed New World protection, creating demand for services the police couldn't provide. Families arrived carrying traditions of clan loyalty and mutual assistance, but these systems worked differently in crowded American cities. Old country methods for resolving disputes didn't translate well to tenement life, where different families from different regions found themselves living on top of each other. Meanwhile, the American legal system remained largely foreign and inaccessible to people who spoke limited English and had little money for lawyers. This gap created opportunities for bilingual mediators who could navigate both worlds, providing informal justice and protection services that filled real community needs. The dense urban landscape meant thousands of people, lived, within blocks of each other, but city services barely reached these forgotten corners. Streets that should have had regular garbage collection piled up with waste. Buildings that needed inspections and repairs operated without oversight. Water and sewage systems that worked properly in better neighborhoods functioned poorly, or not at all in the most crowded areas. The city's rapid growth had simply outpaced its ability to provide basic services to everyone, leaving entire districts to fend for themselves. This neglect created opportunities for anyone willing to organize alternative systems for handling community problems. Kelly recognized that this chaos wasn't a problem to escape. It was raw material to be shaped by someone with vision. Where others saw disorder and danger, Kelly saw flexibility and possibility. The absence of strong official authority meant that unofficial authority could develop and grow without interference. The mixing of different immigrant groups created opportunities for someone who could speak multiple languages and understand various cultural traditions. The dense population provided a large customer base for anyone offering needed services. Most importantly, the neighborhood's invisibility to outside authorities meant that new organizational methods could be tested and refined without attracting unwanted attention. While others saw only poverty and violence, Kelly saw a laboratory where he could test ideas about organization and control. The 5 points offered something that more regulated environments couldn't provide: freedom to experiment with different approaches to leadership and management. Kelly could try various methods for motivating people, organizing activities, and resolving conflicts without worrying about how his experiments might look to judges or newspaper reporters. He could see immediately which approaches worked and which didn't, adjusting his methods based on real results rather than theoretical principles. The neighborhood's desperate circumstances meant people were willing to try new solutions, making them ideal test subjects for Kelly's evolving ideas about criminal organization. The 5 Points District provided something priceless: freedom to experiment with power structures away from traditional authority. This invisible neighborhood would become the testing ground for methods that would spread across America. The organizational techniques that Kelly developed in these crowded streets the leadership principles he learned through trial and error, and the political connections he built by solving real community problems would eventually influence criminal organizations in cities across the country. What started as local solutions to neighborhood problems became the foundation for a new kind of criminal enterprise, one that understood how to work within American systems rather than simply opposing them. How do you lead without anyone noticing? You're in charge. Kelly mastered something most gang leaders never understood: the power of staying in the background. Picture this. You walk into a room where 20 men are arguing about territory and money. Most gang bosses would slam their fist on the table and shout until everyone paid attention. Kelly would find a chair in the corner, sit quietly, and wait. Within minutes, the loudest voices would start looking his way for approval. He had learned something remarkable about human nature. People trust quiet confidence more than they trust loud demands. While other gang bosses made themselves targets with flashy displays of wealth and violence, Kelly developed a completely different approach to leadership. The typical gang leader of that era wanted everyone to know exactly who was in charge. They wore expensive clothes, carried visible weapons, and made sure their names appeared in newspaper headlines. Kelly watched these men carefully and noticed a pattern. The flashier they became, the shorter their careers tended to be. Police targeted them first. Rival gangs challenged them directly. Politicians distanced themselves from anyone too obviously criminal. Kelly decided to try the opposite approach, becoming powerful while remaining practically invisible. His own men sometimes wondered who was really making the decisions, because Kelly's orders often came through intermediaries and suggestions, rather than direct commands. Instead of calling a meeting and barking out assignments, Kelly would have quiet conversations with different people throughout the day. He might mention to one trusted associate that a particular business seemed to need better protection. He might suggest to another that certain gambling operations could benefit from better organization. These casual conversations would somehow transform into coordinated actions without anyone feeling like they had received direct orders. His men began to understand that Kelly's suggestions carried more weight than most bosses' threats. He learned to speak softly in rooms full of loud voices, knowing that people lean in to hear whispers, but tune out shouting. Kelly discovered this principle by watching how conversations flowed in crowded saloons and meeting halls. The men who yelled got temporary attention, but people stopped listening after a few minutes. The men who spoke quietly forced others to come closer and pay closer attention to catch every word. Kelly practiced lowering his voice until people had to strain slightly to hear him clearly. This simple technique made every word seem more important and gave him control over the rhythm of conversations. When Kelly spoke, rooms got quieter instead of louder. Kelly studied how legitimate businessmen conducted meetings, adopting their mannerisms and language to make crime feel professional. He began visiting the lobbies of respectable hotels, watching how successful merchants and bankers interacted with each other. He noticed that these men discussed serious financial matters without raising their voices or making threats. They used specific language about investments, partnerships, and mutual benefits. Kelly started incorporating these phrases into his own conversations. Instead of talking about turf wars, he discussed territory management. Instead of planning robberies, he organized business opportunities. This shift in language made his criminal activities sound like ordinary business decisions. He began dressing better than his circumstances suggested, understanding that appearance shapes how people respond to your ideas. Kelly invested in quality clothing that looked expensive without being flashy. He learned to choose fabrics and styles that suggested success without screaming for attention. His shoes were always clean and well-maintained. His shirts were properly pressed. His hair was carefully groomed. These details cost money that could have bought weapons or bribes. But Kelly understood that appearance was an investment in credibility. People took his suggestions more seriously when he looked like someone who had succeeded in legitimate business. His gang meetings started resembling board meetings. with discussions of territory treated like business expansion plans. Kelly transformed the way his organization made decisions. Instead of gathering in back alleys or basement hideouts, he rented small conference rooms or used the back areas of legitimate businesses. He encouraged his men to sit around tables rather than standing in loose groups. He introduced agendas that covered specific topics in organized sequences. Territory disputes became market analysis sessions. Personnel issues were discussed as staffing decisions. Financial matters were presented as investment opportunities. This formal structure made everyone feel more professional and helped them think more strategically about their activities. Kelly realized that fear motivates temporarily, but respect and profit motivate permanently. So he focused on making his followers prosperous. Traditional gang leaders kept their subordinates desperate and dependent, figuring that hungry men would be more loyal. Kelly tried the opposite approach. He made sure his key people earned steady money from their association with him. He helped them develop skills that would be valuable even if they left his organization. He treated them as partners in profitable enterprises, rather than servants following orders. This investment in his people's success created genuine loyalty that didn't depend on threats or intimidation. His men stayed with him because working for Kelly improved their lives in measurable ways, by making himself seem reasonable and businesslike. Kelly made violence seem like just another tool in a well-organized toolkit. When violence became necessary, Kelly's approach made it feel calculated rather than emotional. His men learned to think of force as a business expense, something you use when other methods fail to achieve specific objectives. Violence became a professional decision rather than a personal response to disrespect or anger. This shift in thinking made Kelly's organization more effective, because violence was applied strategically rather than impulsively. It also made them less likely to attract unwanted attention from law enforcement, since their actions appeared planned rather than chaotic. This subtle shift in leadership style would become the template for how modern organized crime bosses present themselves to the world. Kelly's innovations in invisible leadership created a model that criminal organizations would copy for decades to come. What happens when crime and politics discover they need each other? Kelly's relationship with Tammany Hall reveals how corruption becomes systematic rather than accidental. Think about two puzzle pieces that seem completely different but fit together perfectly when you turn them the right way. On one side, you have Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that controlled New York City through careful organization and strategic vote gathering. On the other side, you have Kelly's 5 Points Gang, a criminal organization that had learned to think like a business rather than just a street crew. Neither side planned this partnership, but once they discovered how well their needs matched up, something much bigger than either organization began to take shape. Most gang leaders saw politicians as enemies or obstacles, but Kelly recognized them as potential business partners with complementary needs. The typical approach involved criminals trying to intimidate politicians, or politicians trying to crush criminal organizations. Kelly watched these confrontations play out, and noticed that both sides usually lost more than they gained. Politicians, who fought gangs directly, often found their campaigns disrupted by violence and chaos. Gang leaders who threatened politicians usually ended up in prison or worse. Kelly began to wonder what might happen if these two forces worked together instead of against each other. He started studying Tammany Hall, the same way he had once studied the flow of money through his neighborhood. Tammany Hall needed votes and muscle to maintain power, while Kelly needed protection and legitimacy. But bringing these worlds together required delicate negotiation. The political machine faced a practical problem that Kelly could solve. Elections required massive coordination to get supporters to polling places, manage the voting process, and handle any disruptions that might arise. Tammany Hall had the organization, but lacked the street-level muscle needed to ensure everything ran smoothly. Kelly's gang had exactly that kind of practical capability. Plus, they understood the immigrant communities that made up a huge portion of the voting population. Meanwhile, Kelly needed something that only politicians could provide: protection from law enforcement and access to legitimate power structures. Kelly began attending political meetings, not as a thug, demanding favors, but as a community leader, offering solutions to mutual problems. He transformed his appearance and manner for these occasions, dressing like a successful businessman rather than a gang leader. Instead of making threats or demands, Kelly listened carefully to the challenges that Tammany officials discussed. When they mentioned difficulties reaching Italian voters, Kelly offered to help with translation and community outreach. When they worried about disruptions at polling places, Kelly suggested ways his organization could provide security. He presented himself as someone who understood both the immigrant community's needs and the practical requirements of running successful political campaigns. He learned the language of politics, understanding that the same goals could be achieved through backroom deals instead of street violence. Kelly discovered that politicians talked about power differently than criminals did. They discussed influence, constituencies, and mutual benefits rather than territory and respect. Kelly adapted his vocabulary to match their style. He learned to describe his criminal activities in political terms. Protection services became community security programs. Gambling operations became social clubs that happened to generate revenue. Vote buying became voter education and turnout assistance. This shift in language helped both sides feel more comfortable with arrangements that might have seemed obviously corrupt if described more directly. The gang's role in elections grew more sophisticated, moving from simple intimidation to organized voter mobilization and ballot management. Early gang involvement in politics typically meant threatening opposition voters or stuffing ballot boxes with fake votes. Kelly developed more elegant methods that achieved better results while creating less obvious evidence of wrongdoing. His people learned to identify sympathetic voters weeks before elections and help them navigate the registration process. They organized transportation to polling places for elderly and disabled supporters. They provided translation services for immigrant voters who struggled with English language ballots. These services created genuine goodwill while ensuring that votes went to Tammany candidates. Kelly discovered that politicians preferred dealing with one reliable contact rather than dozens of unpredictable street criminals. Tammany Hall leaders had grown tired of managing relationships with multiple gang leaders, who often fought among themselves and made conflicting demands. Kelly offered something much more appealing: single point of contact, who could speak for a large, well-organized group. Politicians could make one phone call to Kelly instead of negotiating separately with various neighborhood crews. Kelly guaranteed that his people would follow through on agreements and handle problems quietly rather than creating public scandals. This streamlined approach made him invaluable to politicians who needed criminal services but wanted to minimize their exposure to criminal behavior. By positioning himself as that single point of contact, Kelly became indispensable to both sides of increasingly complex arrangements. Politicians began routing all their street-level needs through Kelly's organization. Kelly's people became the unofficial enforcement arm of Tammany Hall's political operations. But Kelly also made himself essential to other criminal groups by positioning himself as their representative in political negotiations. Smaller gangs discovered that they could achieve more by working through Kelly's established political connections than by trying to build their own relationships with politicians. Kelly became a bridge between two worlds that had previously operated separately. The 1901 election demonstrated Kelly's new model: thousands of organized supporters responding to political coordination rather than chaotic street fighting. When Election Day arrived, Kelly's contribution went far beyond traditional gang activities. His organization mobilized massive numbers of voters through carefully planned logistics rather than random intimidation. Polling places operated smoothly because Kelly's people provided security and crowd management. Vote counts proceeded without major disputes because potential problems had been identified and resolved ahead of time. The election results showed what could be accomplished when criminal organizations served political goals rather than opposing them. This partnership showed how organized crime could embed itself into legitimate power structures without destroying them. Kelly had discovered something that would reshape American politics and criminal activity for generations to come. How do you turn a devastating gang war into a strategic advantage? Kelly's conflict with Monk Eastman reveals the difference between fighting to survive and fighting to grow stronger. Most gang leaders saw war as a simple equation: destroy your enemy completely or be destroyed yourself. But Kelly had been watching how legitimate businesses handled competition, and he noticed something interesting. The most successful companies didn't always try to crush their competitors. Sometimes they used competition to improve their own operations, making themselves stronger through the process of fighting. When Monk Eastman's gang challenged 5 Points territory, most observers expected a typical bloodbath that would weaken both organizations. Eastman ran his crew the old-fashioned way, with brutal discipline and direct confrontation. His reputation for violence was legendary even by Lower East Side standards. When territorial disputes arose between his gang and Kelly's people, everyone assumed this would play out like every other gang war in the neighborhood's history. Two groups would fight until one was completely destroyed or driven away, leaving the winner damaged and vulnerable to the next challenge. Newspaper reporters prepared to cover another senseless cycle of immigrant violence that would reinforce every stereotype about criminal behavior in poor neighborhoods. But Kelly approached this war differently. Instead of seeking total destruction of his enemy, he used the conflict to demonstrate his gang's discipline and organization. Kelly saw this confrontation as an opportunity to showcase everything his people had learned about coordination and strategic thinking. Rather than launching random attacks or responding emotionally to provocations, Kelly treated each clash as a training exercise for his men. He wanted to show the political leaders who had begun working with him that his organization could handle serious pressure without losing control or creating unnecessary chaos. This war would become a public test of whether Kelly's methods really worked better than traditional gang leadership. The famous gun battle that forced police to retreat became a public display of the 5 Points gang's superior coordination under pressure. When the shooting started, Kelly's men moved with precision that surprised everyone watching. They took defensive positions that had been planned in advance. They conserved ammunition while maintaining steady fire. Most importantly, they followed orders even in the heat of combat, demonstrating discipline that most people didn't expect from street criminals. The police officers who responded to the gunfire found themselves outmaneuvered by criminals who seemed to understand tactics better than they did. This forced retreat became front-page news, but Kelly made sure the coverage emphasized his gang's organization rather than just their firepower. Kelly allowed politicians to broker negotiations, showing that his organization could work within systems rather than just destroying them. When Tammany Hall leaders offered to mediate between the warring gangs, Kelly accepted immediately. Eastman resisted these diplomatic efforts, preferring to settle matters through continued violence. Kelly's willingness to participate in formal negotiations demonstrated something important to his political allies. His organization could be reasoned with, controlled, and directed toward useful purposes. Politicians began to see Kelly's gang as a resource they could work with rather than just a problem they needed to contain. This diplomatic approach also gave Kelly opportunities to study his opponent's weaknesses while presenting himself as the reasonable party in an unreasonable conflict. Even the failed boxing match between gang representatives served Kelly's purposes by making his gang appear reasonable and willing to seek peaceful solutions. When negotiations led to the idea of settling the war through a formal boxing match between representatives from each gang, Kelly supported this unusual proposal enthusiastically. The match itself ended in chaos when supporters from both sides turned it into another brawl. But Kelly had already achieved his real objective. His willingness to try this peaceful alternative made him look like a responsible leader who preferred civilization to barbarism. Eastman's participation in the same event looked impulsive and uncontrolled by comparison. Kelly understood that public perception mattered more than the actual outcome of any single confrontation. While Eastman's crew remained a traditional street gang, Kelly used the war to professionalize his organization's response to external threats. Every skirmish became a lesson in military-style coordination. Kelly assigned specific roles to different men and evaluated their performance after each encounter. He developed communication systems that allowed his people to coordinate actions across multiple locations. He established supply lines for weapons and medical care that functioned reliably under stress. Kelly's gang began operating more like a militia than a criminal organization, with clear command structures and standard procedures for handling various types of conflicts. These improvements made them more effective fighters, but more importantly, they made Kelly's people feel professional rather than desperate. The conflict taught Kelly's men that violence should serve larger strategic goals rather than just settling personal disputes. Kelly used the war as an extended training course in strategic thinking. He explained to his people how each battle connected to broader objectives like political influence and business expansion. He showed them how violence could be used as a tool for achieving specific goals, rather than just an emotional response to disrespect or territory violations. Kelly's men learned to ask themselves what they hoped to accomplish before they acted, rather than simply reacting to whatever their opponents did. This shift in thinking made them more dangerous opponents, but also more reliable allies for the politicians and businessmen who were beginning to work with Kelly's organization. When Eastman was imprisoned in 1904, Kelly had positioned his gang not as the victors of a street war, but as the more sophisticated organization. Kelly's strategic approach to the conflict had transformed his reputation throughout the city. This approach to conflict management would become a hallmark of modern, organized crime, using violence strategically rather than emotionally. What does it take to make crime look respectable? Kelly's athletic club reveals how criminal organizations can hide in plain sight by mimicking legitimate institutions. Imagine walking into an elegant social club where well-dressed gentlemen discuss business over cigars and brandy. The conversation flows smoothly between stock investments and charitable fundraising. The members shake hands firmly and exchange calling cards with embossed letterheads. Everything appears perfectly normal until you realize that half the men in the room have killed people and the other half don't know it yet. This was the remarkable achievement of Kelly's new Brighton Athletic Club, a place where two completely different worlds existed in the same space, without either side fully understanding what was happening. At 57 Great Jones Street, Kelly opened what appeared to be an upscale social club, complete with all the trappings of respectable society. The building itself had been carefully chosen for its location and appearance. Great Jones Street attracted successful merchants and professionals who appreciated the quiet dignity of the neighborhood. Kelly invested heavily in the club's interior design, installing polished wood paneling, leather furniture, and crystal chandeliers that wouldn't look out of place in the finest gentlemen's clubs uptown. The front entrance featured a brass nameplate and uniformed doorman who greeted visitors with the same courtesy they would receive at any exclusive establishment. Kelly understood that atmosphere shapes perception, so he created an environment that whispered wealth and refinement rather than shouting about criminal connections. But this wasn't just a front. It was Kelly's laboratory for testing whether criminals could successfully infiltrate higher social circles. Kelly had spent years observing how legitimate businessmen conducted themselves, but observation alone couldn't teach him everything he needed to know. He needed a controlled environment where his people could practice interacting with respectable society without the high stakes of important business negotiations. The athletic club provided exactly that opportunity. Kelly could experiment with different approaches to conversation, test various methods of building trust, and see which criminal activities could be discussed openly and which needed to remain completely hidden. Every social interaction became a learning experience that helped Kelly refine his understanding of how legitimate society really worked. The club attracted genuine socialites and businessmen who had no idea they were mingling with some of New York's most dangerous criminals. Kelly's reputation as a community leader and successful entrepreneur preceded him in these circles. His involvement with labor organizations gave him legitimate credentials that impressed business owners who dealt with worker management issues. His political connections provided common ground for conversations with men who needed favors from Tammany Hall. These legitimate members brought their friends and business associates to the club, creating a growing network of respectable people who began to see Kelly and his associates as valuable connections rather than potential threats. The club's membership rolls gradually filled with names from established New York families who had no idea they were socializing with professional criminals. Kelly studied how legitimate club members conducted themselves, adopting their mannerisms and social customs for his own organization. He watched carefully as business deals were negotiated over dinner rather than in formal offices. He noticed how successful men used humor to deflect difficult questions and how they built trust through shared recreational activities. Kelly observed the subtle social signals that indicated when someone was interested in hearing a proposal and when they preferred to keep conversations light. He learned the proper etiquette for introducing people to each other and the art of remembering personal details that made later conversations feel more intimate. These lessons in social sophistication transformed how Kelly's entire organization approached their interactions with legitimate society. Gang meetings disguised as social gatherings allowed Kelly to conduct business while teaching his men how to move in respectable society. Instead of gathering in back rooms or abandoned warehouses, Kelly began holding important organizational meetings during club social events. A poker game became an opportunity to discuss territory assignments. A billiards tournament provided cover for conversations about political strategy. Boxing matches in the club's gymnasium allowed Kelly to address his men about upcoming operations while appearing to simply enjoy recreational sports. These dual-purpose gatherings served Kelly's immediate organizational needs while giving his people extended practice in behaving like gentlemen rather than street thugs. His men learned to moderate their language, control their tempers, and present themselves as successful businessmen rather than dangerous criminals. The club's success proved that, with the right presentation, criminal organizations could access social networks previously beyond their reach. Kelly discovered that respectability opened doors that money and threats could never budge. Business owners who would never meet with obvious criminals became willing to discuss mutually beneficial arrangements with fellow club members. Politicians who couldn't be seen associating with gang leaders found it perfectly acceptable to socialize with prominent community figures at athletic events. Society ladies who organized charity fundraisers welcomed contributions from successful entrepreneurs without asking too many questions about the source of their wealth. Kelly's transformation from neighborhood tough guy to respectable club member gave him access to information, opportunities, and relationships that traditional criminal methods could never have provided. Kelly discovered that many legitimate businessmen were surprisingly comfortable with morally ambiguous partnerships when presented professionally. The business community operated by more flexible ethical standards than Kelly had initially expected. Merchants who presented themselves as pillars of respectability often needed services that weren't entirely legal. Politicians who spoke publicly about law and order frequently required assistance that couldn't be provided through official channels. Even charity organizations sometimes found themselves in situations where conventional solutions wouldn't work. Kelly learned that the difference between criminal and legitimate business was often a matter of presentation rather than substance. when illegal services were offered as business solutions rather than criminal activities. Many respectable people proved surprisingly willing to consider them. The New Brighton Athletic Club demonstrated that organized crime could evolve beyond street-level operations into sophisticated social engineering. This model of using legitimate fronts to build criminal networks would become standard practice for future organized crime families. How does surviving death change a criminal mastermind? The 1905 assassination attempt on Kelly reveals how near experiences can accelerate evolution rather than end it. Picture a man who has spent years carefully building something remarkable, only to have it all threatened by a single moment of violence. Most people would see this as a warning to step back, to retreat into safer territory. But some minds work differently. For them, brushing against death becomes a teacher rather than a deterrent, showing them possibilities they never considered. When they felt invincible, the attack on Kelly seemed like it would mark the end of his carefully built empire, but instead it became the catalyst for his most significant transformation. The gunshots rang out on a busy street, and suddenly, the man who had made himself indispensable to politicians and respected by society found himself bleeding on the pavement. The newspapers covered the story with the kind of attention Kelly had spent years trying to avoid. His name appeared in headlines, alongside words like gang leader and criminal, destroying the careful image he had built through the New Brighton Athletic Club. The shooting stripped away the protective layer of respectability that had allowed Kelly to move between legitimate and criminal circles without attracting unwanted scrutiny. As Kelly recovered from his wounds, he faced a choice. He could retreat into traditional gang leadership, or use this setback as an opportunity to reinvent his entire approach. The hospital bed gave Kelly plenty of time to think about what had gone wrong. He had become too visible, too obviously important to his organization. The assassination attempt proved that his enemies could identify him easily and target him directly. Kelly realized that his success had created its own vulnerabilities. The more prominent he became in legitimate society, the more exposed he was to people who wanted to destroy him. But Kelly's mind worked differently than most people facing similar situations. Instead of seeing this as a reason to give up his innovations, he saw it as information about how to improve them. The closure of the New Brighton Athletic Club by police could have been seen as a devastating blow to his carefully crafted, respectable image. The authorities used the assassination attempt as justification for shutting down the club and investigating its members. Respectable businessmen who had socialized there suddenly found their names connected to criminal investigations. The social network that Kelly had spent years building began to crumble as legitimate members distanced themselves from anything associated with his name. The elegant meeting rooms, where criminal and legitimate business had blended seamlessly, were sealed by police tape. Kelly watched years of careful work disappear almost overnight. Instead, Kelly recognized that his public profile had become a liability and began developing methods for wielding influence from the shadows. The hospital stay gave Kelly time to study his situation with the same analytical approach he had used to understand his neighborhood years earlier. He realized that visibility and power didn't have to go together. In fact, the most successful people often wielded enormous influence without attracting public attention. Kelly began thinking about how he could maintain control over his organization while removing himself from the direct line of fire that came with obvious leadership. He started designing systems that would allow him to guide operations without being clearly connected to them. He started delegating more authority to trusted lieutenants while maintaining strategic control over major decisions. Kelly identified the most capable people in his organization and began training them to handle day-to-day operations independently. Instead of micromanaging every detail, he focused on setting overall direction and establishing principles that his people could follow without constant supervision. Kelly developed communication methods that allowed him to stay informed about important developments without requiring face-to-face meetings that might be observed by enemies or police. He created layers of management that protected him from direct involvement in routine criminal activities, while ensuring that his vision continued to guide the organization's development. The assassination attempt taught Kelly that ultimate success meant becoming too valuable to kill rather than too dangerous to approach. Kelly began analyzing why certain people seemed immune to the kind of violence he had just experienced. He noticed that the most protected individuals weren't necessarily the most feared, but rather the most useful to powerful people. Kelly started thinking about how he could make himself indispensable to enough important people that removing him would create serious problems for individuals who had the power to protect him. This meant shifting his focus from building fear-based respect to creating genuine dependency among people who could influence law enforcement and political decisions. He began focusing on building relationships that would make his removal costly to powerful people who benefited from his services. Kelly identified politicians, businessmen, and community leaders who relied on services that only his organization could provide reliably. He made sure these relationships involved ongoing benefits rather than one-time transactions, creating situations where his absence would cause real problems for people who had grown dependent on his capabilities. Kelly understood that the best protection came not from hiding, but from making himself so useful that potential enemies would face opposition from unexpected allies if they moved against him, rather than making Kelly more cautious. The experience made him more sophisticated in his approach to power and survival. This brush with mortality pushed Kelly to develop the low-profile, high-influence model that would define modern organized crime leadership. How does a criminal mastermind become a legitimate labor leader? Kelly's transformation into Paul Vaccarelli of the International Longshoremen's Association shows how organized crime adapts to changing opportunities. Think about a river that suddenly changes course, finding a new path through the landscape that offers less resistance and better flow. By the early 1920s, Kelly had been watching American society shift in ways that created completely new possibilities for someone with his particular talents. The old methods of criminal enterprise were becoming more dangerous and less profitable. But something entirely different was emerging, something that offered legal protection for activities that had previously required constant hiding. By the 1920s, Kelly had discovered that labor unions offered something traditional criminal enterprises couldn't: legal authority over thousands of workers and millions of dollars. Labor organizations possessed something that fascinated Kelly. They could control large groups of people through legitimate institutional power rather than fear or violence. Union leaders had legal authority to call strikes that could shut down entire industries. They managed pension funds and benefit programs worth more money than most banks handled. They negotiated contracts that determined how major businesses operated. Most remarkably, they could use force to maintain discipline within their organizations without facing criminal charges. Since union security was considered a legitimate business concern, Kelly saw that becoming a labor leader would give him power that no traditional criminal boss could ever achieve. But infiltrating legitimate labor organizations required Kelly to master an entirely new set of skills, while maintaining his criminal network's loyalty and effectiveness. The longshoremen who worked the docks had their own culture, their own language, and their own ideas about leadership. Kelly couldn't simply announce himself as their new boss and expect compliance. He needed to understand the actual problems. These workers faced everyday dangerous working conditions, inconsistent wages, arbitrary treatment by shipping companies, and competition from new immigrant groups willing to work for less money. Kelly spent months learning about cargo handling, dock procedures, and maritime commerce. He studied the economics of shipping to understand how profits flowed through the industry and where workers might have leverage in negotiations. As Paul Vaccarelli, he learned to speak the language of workers' rights, while using those same workers as a disciplined force for his broader objectives. Kelly discovered that labor organizing required many of the same skills he had developed in criminal leadership, but applied to different goals. He learned to identify the natural leaders among dock workers and win their respect through small favors and practical solutions to everyday problems. He practiced giving speeches about fair wages and workplace safety, subjects that genuinely mattered to his audience but also served his need to build personal loyalty. Kelly found that workers responded to leaders who could deliver tangible improvements in their daily lives. So he focused on solving specific problems that previous union leaders had ignored or failed to address effectively. The 1919 expulsion from the ILA became just another obstacle to overcome rather than a permanent setback, demonstrating his persistence and adaptability. When union officials discovered Kelly's criminal background and forced him out of leadership positions, he treated this setback the same way he had handled previous challenges, his useful information about what adjustments needed to be made. Kelly realized that his approach had been too direct and visible. He began working behind the scenes instead, supporting other candidates for union leadership while maintaining influence through personal relationships and financial assistance. Kelly learned to exercise control through intermediaries, just as he had done with his criminal organization. The expulsion taught him that labor organizing required even more subtlety than criminal leadership. Since union members could vote their leaders out of office, Kelly's return to union leadership and role in suppressing the port strike showed how he could serve multiple masters workers, employers, and politicians simultaneously. When Kelly regained official union positions, he faced a complex situation that tested all his skills in managing competing interests. Workers wanted higher wages and better conditions. Shipping companies wanted reliable service and controlled costs. Politicians wanted labor peace that wouldn't disrupt commerce or create bad publicity. Kelly discovered that he could satisfy all three groups by becoming the person who could guarantee solutions when problems arose. His criminal organization provided enforcement capabilities that pure labor organizing couldn't offer, while his union position gave him legitimate authority to negotiate on behalf of thousands of workers. His partnership with Mayor John F. Hylan revealed how deeply criminal influence had penetrated legitimate power structures by the 1920s. Kelly's relationship with the mayor demonstrated something remarkable about American politics during this period. The boundaries between criminal and legitimate authority had become so blurred that cooperation was not only possible but mutually beneficial. Hylan needed someone who could maintain labor peace during a period of economic uncertainty. Kelly needed political protection for his various activities. Their partnership worked because both men understood that practical results mattered more than moral purity. Kelly could deliver labor cooperation when the mayor needed it, while Hylan could ensure that law enforcement didn't interfere too much with Kelly's operations. The successful strike suppression demonstrated that Kelly's methods could achieve results that traditional approaches couldn't match. When dock strikes threatened to shut down New York's port, Kelly's dual role as criminal boss and labor leader allowed him to apply pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. He could negotiate with workers as their legitimate representative, while also using his criminal organization to discourage prolonged disruption. This combination of legitimate authority and unofficial enforcement created a level of control that neither pure labor organizing nor simple criminal intimidation could have achieved alone. Kelly's dual identity as criminal boss and labor leader proved that organized crime's future lay in controlling legitimate institutions rather than opposing them. This model of infiltrating rather than confronting legal authority would become the blueprint for organized crime's evolution into a shadow government. What happens when a criminal genius starts teaching others? Kelly's influence on future organized crime leaders reveals how knowledge transfers across generations of criminals. Think about a master craftsman who has spent decades perfecting techniques that others barely understand. Most skilled professionals take their knowledge to the grave. But occasionally someone comes along who recognizes that their innovations could outlast their own lifetime if properly shared. Kelly had reached a point where his methods had proven themselves repeatedly, but he was also approaching an age where he needed to think about what would happen to all this accumulated wisdom when he was no longer around to guide operations directly. By the 1920s, Kelly had attracted the attention of ambitious young criminals who recognized that his methods offered something traditional gang leadership couldn't provide. These weren't the typical street thugs who dominated most criminal organizations. Kelly's reputation had spread through underground networks, drawing men who had observed the failures of conventional gang leadership and wanted to learn something better. They had watched other criminal bosses rise and fall through predictable patterns of violence and imprisonment. Kelly's longevity and success suggested that he understood principles of criminal organization that others had missed completely. Young criminals began seeking him out, not just for temporary alliances, but for education in methods that might allow them to build lasting enterprises rather than brief, violent careers. But passing on his sophisticated approach to crime required Kelly to identify students capable of thinking beyond immediate gratification and street-level violence. Kelly had learned through hard experience that most criminals possessed temperaments that made them unsuitable for the kind of long-term thinking his methods required. They wanted quick profits, immediate respect, and simple solutions to complex problems. Kelly needed to find men who could delay gratification, think several moves ahead, and understand that the most powerful actions often appeared boring or indirect to casual observers. He began testing potential protégés by giving them small responsibilities that required patience and subtle judgment rather than obvious displays of force or criminal skill. John Torrio emerged as Kelly's most promising protégé, demonstrating the intellectual capacity to understand and expand upon his mentor's organizational principles, building relationships and developing infrastructure rather than rushing toward immediate criminal profits. Kelly recognized that Torrio had the mental flexibility to take his innovations and improve upon them rather than just copying them mechanically. Kelly's teachings emphasized patience, political connections, and long-term strategic thinking over the impulsive violence that characterized most criminal organizations. During their conversations, Kelly shared lessons he had learned about the importance of building relationships with legitimate power structures. He explained how political connections could provide protection that violence alone could never achieve. Kelly taught Torrio to think about criminal activities as business investments that needed to generate sustainable profits over years rather than quick scores that might attract unwanted attention. He emphasized the value of appearing respectable while conducting illegal business, showing Torrio how legitimate social connections could open doors that criminal reputation alone would keep permanently closed. The relationship with Arnold Rothstein provided Kelly's students access to even more sophisticated criminal financing and cross-regional coordination. Rothstein operated at a level of criminal sophistication that impressed even Kelly, managing illegal enterprises that spanned multiple states and required coordination with corrupt officials at various levels of government. Through his connection with Rothstein, Kelly could offer his protégés exposure to criminal methods that went far beyond anything they could learn in local street operations. Rothstein's financial networks showed Kelly's students how criminal profits could be invested and multiplied through legitimate business ventures, creating wealth that couldn't be confiscated through traditional law enforcement methods. Kelly watched as his former associates like Al Capone and Lucky Luciano adapted his New York methods to different cities and circumstances. Capone took Kelly's lessons about political corruption and applied them to Chicago's unique political landscape, building relationships with politicians and police officials that protected his operations from serious interference. Luciano absorbed Kelly's teachings about organizational structure and used them to create criminal enterprises that functioned more like corporations than traditional gangs. Both men demonstrated that Kelly's innovations could be successfully transplanted to different environments, proving that his methods represented genuine principles rather than techniques that only worked in specific circumstances. The success of his students validated Kelly's belief that organized crime could become a national enterprise rather than just local neighborhood gangs. As Kelly's protégés established successful operations in cities across America, they maintained communication networks that allowed for coordination and mutual support. This created something unprecedented in American criminal history, a loose confederation of criminal organizations that shared methods, resources, and intelligence while maintaining independent operations in their respective territories. Kelly's teaching had helped create the foundation for what would eventually become a national criminal syndicate. Kelly's role as mentor proved that criminal knowledge could be systematized and taught, creating a new generation of sophisticated criminal leaders. This educational approach to criminal leadership would ensure that Kelly's innovations survived and evolved long after his direct influence ended. How does a local gang's methods become a national criminal network? The evolution from Kelly's 5 Points Gang to the Atlantic City Conference reveals organized crime's transformation into a shadow economy. Imagine watching a single drop of ink spread through a glass of clear water. At first, the color stays concentrated in one small area, but slowly it begins to move outward, following invisible currents until the entire glass takes on a new hue. Kelly's innovations spread through American criminal organizations in much the same way, moving from person to person and city to city until they had colored the entire landscape of organized crime. Kelly's organizational principles had spread far beyond New York, but coordinating criminal activities across multiple cities required innovations that even he hadn't fully anticipated. The men Kelly had taught were establishing successful operations in Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and dozens of smaller cities. Each of these criminal leaders had adapted Kelly's methods to their local circumstances, creating variations that worked well in their particular environments. But as these organizations grew larger and more profitable, they began encountering problems that individual groups couldn't solve alone. Territorial disputes arose when criminal activities crossed city boundaries. Competition for the same resources led to conflicts that hurt everyone's profits. Most challenging of all, law enforcement agencies had begun sharing information across jurisdictions, making it harder for criminal groups to operate in isolation. The challenge was creating unity among independent criminal organizations without destroying the local knowledge and connections that made each group effective. Traditional approaches to criminal cooperation had always failed because they required someone to give up their independence to a more powerful leader. Kelly's former students understood that this old model wouldn't work for what they were trying to build. Each criminal organization had developed relationships with local politicians, police officials, and business leaders that took years to establish and couldn't be transferred to outsiders. These local connections were too valuable to risk by joining some larger organization that might not understand regional differences. The solution required finding ways to coordinate activities while preserving the independence that made each group successful. Kelly's blueprint emphasized cooperation over competition, profit sharing over territory wars, and political influence over street violence. The principles Kelly had developed for managing his single organization needed to be scaled up to handle relationships between multiple independent groups. Kelly had always taught that competition should drive improvement, rather than destruction. Criminal organizations could compete for efficiency and innovation while cooperating on larger strategic goals. Profit-sharing arrangements could align everyone's interests without requiring anyone to surrender control over their own operations. Most importantly, political influence needed to be coordinated so that criminal organizations could support each other's relationships with legitimate authorities, rather than accidentally undermining them through conflicting activities. The 1929 Atlantic City Conference, presided over by Al Capone, demonstrated how Kelly's local innovations had evolved into national coordination mechanisms. The meeting brought together criminal leaders from across America to discuss common problems and develop coordinated solutions. The conference used many of the organizational methods that Kelly had pioneered years earlier. Discussions proceeded through formal agendas rather than chaotic arguments. Decisions were reached through negotiation and compromise rather than violence and intimidation. Participants treated each other as business partners rather than potential enemies. The entire event felt more like a corporate board meeting than a gathering of dangerous criminals. Prohibition provided the economic engine that made national coordination profitable. But Kelly's organizational methods provided the structural framework. The alcohol trade created opportunities that required coordination across state lines and international borders. Individual criminal groups could handle local distribution, but importing, transportation, and large-scale manufacturing required cooperation between organizations with different specialties and geographic advantages. Kelly's methods for managing complex operations with multiple moving parts proved perfectly suited to the challenges of running a national illegal business. The organizational skills his protégés had learned allowed them to coordinate these massive operations without losing control or creating unnecessary conflicts. The conference showed that criminal organizations could negotiate and coordinate like legitimate businesses while maintaining their illegal activities. The participants discussed territory divisions using the same language that corporate executives might use to discuss market segmentation. They negotiated profit-sharing arrangements with the same attention to detail that business partners would apply to joint ventures. They established communication protocols that allowed for ongoing coordination without requiring constant face-to-face meetings. Most remarkably, they created dispute resolution mechanisms that could handle conflicts peacefully rather than through violence. These innovations proved that criminal enterprises could adopt sophisticated business practices without losing their effectiveness in illegal activities. Kelly's influence was visible in the conference's emphasis on reducing violence, dividing territories peacefully, and maximizing profits through cooperation. The meeting's outcomes reflected priorities that Kelly had been teaching for decades. Violence was treated as a business expense that should be minimized whenever possible. Territorial conflicts were resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. Competitive advantages were developed through innovation and efficiency rather than simply eliminating rivals. These approaches had proven successful in Kelly's own operations, and now they were being applied to coordinate criminal activities on a national scale. The national syndicate that emerged from these meetings represented the full realization of Kelly's vision: crime as a sophisticated, coordinated business enterprise. This transformation from local gang to national network proved that Kelly's quiet innovations had fundamentally changed the nature of organized crime in America. Criminal organizations had evolved from neighborhood gangs into something resembling a shadow government with its own systems of law, diplomacy, and economic coordination. How does a man become both a criminal mastermind and a legitimate community figure? Kelly's final years reveal the ultimate paradox of his transformation through contradiction. Picture someone who could attend a union meeting in the morning, genuinely fighting for workers' safety and fair wages, then spend the evening coordinating illegal activities that would have horrified those same workers. This wasn't simple hypocrisy or clever disguise. Kelly had somehow developed the ability to inhabit two completely different moral universes simultaneously, switching between them as naturally as changing clothes. By the 1930s, Kelly had achieved something unprecedented. He was simultaneously one of America's most influential criminals and a recognized legitimate labor leader. Newspaper articles praised Paul Vaccarelli's dedication to worker rights and his successful negotiations with shipping companies. The same publications sometimes mentioned investigations into organized crime activities that Kelly orchestrated, though they rarely connected these two identities explicitly. Kelly maintained offices for his union work that were completely separate from his criminal operations. He attended charity fundraisers and political dinners where respectable citizens treated him as a valuable community leader. Meanwhile, criminal organizations across the country sought his advice on organizational methods and strategic planning. These two reputations existed side by side, without canceling each other out. This dual existence required Kelly to maintain completely different personalities and moral frameworks depending on which world he was operating in at any given moment. When Kelly spoke at union meetings, his voice carried genuine passion about workplace safety and economic justice. He could discuss the dignity of honest labor with conviction that moved his audiences. His knowledge of dock work, shipping schedules, and maritime commerce was real and detailed. Kelly had invested years learning these subjects because he understood that effective leadership required genuine expertise. But when the same man met with criminal associates, he shifted into a different mode entirely. His voice became quieter, more calculating. His concerns focused on profit margins, territorial boundaries, and political protection. The moral framework that guided his union work simply didn't apply to these conversations. His ability to switch between ruthless criminal calculation and genuine concern for workers' welfare demonstrated a psychological complexity that few could match. Kelly had developed something that most people never achieve: the capacity to hold contradictory values simultaneously without experiencing internal conflict. When he negotiated contracts for dock workers, Kelly fought hard for provisions that would improve their lives, even when these improvements reduced profits for businesses he had relationships with. His criminal activities generated money that sometimes funded union benefits and strike support for workers who had no idea where the assistance came from. Kelly seemed capable of compartmentalizing his different roles so completely that he could pursue contradictory goals with equal energy and sincerity. Kelly's success proved that the traditional boundaries between legal and illegal, legitimate and criminal, were more flexible than most people assumed. American society operated with clearer moral categories in theory than in practice. Kelly discovered that many legitimate institutions relied on services that weren't entirely legal when you examined them closely. Labor unions needed muscle for picket line enforcement. Political campaigns required vote mobilization that sometimes bent election rules. Business negotiations occasionally demanded pressure tactics that skirted legal boundaries. Kelly provided these services through criminal organizations, but he presented them as solutions to legitimate problems. The boundaries that seemed so clear in newspaper editorials became much blurrier in actual business and political operations. He had created a model where crime and legitimate business could coexist and even strengthen each other when properly managed. Kelly's criminal organization provided enforcement capabilities that his union work couldn't offer through legal channels. His legitimate union position gave him access to information and relationships that proved valuable for criminal activities. The two roles created synergies that made both more effective than either could have been independently. Kelly's political connections, developed through legitimate labor organizing, protected his criminal operations from law enforcement interference. Meanwhile, his criminal organization's discipline and coordination made his union leadership more effective than traditional labor organizing methods could achieve. Kelly's death in 1936 marked the end of an era, but his methods had already spread throughout American organized crime. The news of his passing prompted obituaries that focused entirely on his labor organizing achievements, with no mention of his criminal activities. Union members who had benefited from his leadership mourned the loss of an effective advocate. Meanwhile, criminal leaders across the country recognized that they had lost an important teacher and coordinator. The organizational principles Kelly had developed continued to influence how criminal enterprises operated, but no single person could replicate his unique combination of legitimate authority and criminal effectiveness. The paradox of his character Organizer and violent criminal, labor advocate, and corrupt boss reflected the contradictions of American society itself. Kelly's ability to succeed in both legitimate and criminal worlds revealed something important about the country he had adopted. American society valued results more than methods when the results served useful purposes. Political leaders worked with Kelly because he could deliver labor peace. Business owners respected him because he could solve problems that conventional approaches couldn't handle. Workers trusted him because he improved their daily lives in measurable ways. Kelly had discovered that moral consistency mattered less than practical effectiveness in a society focused on getting things done. Kelly's life demonstrated that in America, transformation is always possible for those willing to master the complex rules of power and influence. His greatest achievement wasn't building a criminal empire, but proving that criminal enterprises could evolve into something resembling legitimate institutions. Kelly had shown that the American dream of reinvention applied even to criminals willing to think beyond traditional criminal methods. Paul Kelly's quiet transformation from Paolo Vaccarelli to criminal mastermind shows us that the most profound changes often happen gradually, almost invisibly, until suddenly the entire landscape has shifted. He didn't announce his evolution with grand gestures or dramatic moments. Instead, he made small adjustments day by day, learning to speak differently, dress better, think more strategically. Each tiny change seemed insignificant by itself, but together they created something completely new. His legacy lives on not in dramatic confrontations or legendary shootouts, but in the sophisticated methods that continue to shape how power and influence operate in the shadows of American society. The organizational techniques Kelly developed, the political relationships he pioneered, and the business-like approach he brought to criminal enterprise became the template for modern organized crime. His innovations in invisible leadership and institutional infiltration created a model that criminal organizations still follow today. As you drift off tonight, consider how Kelly's story reminds us that transformation, whether for good or ill, often begins with small, seemingly insignificant choices that accumulate over time into something much larger than anyone originally imagined.